Okay, sorry, it's just like school, it starts at 1:30, you've got to listen. Lasts exactly an hour, then you can do what you like. Right, this is a session. This is a session having very much to do with the whole question of the translation of Chinese poetry into English, the bringing of Chinese poetry into English, the difficulties of that, and some issues that we shall raise along the way, which I hope will have to do with the situation and the effectiveness of poetry in any context, not just the Chinese. First of all, I'd like to introduce the experts. I'm just the one who's trying to speak into a microphone with no practice whatsoever. But along there, first of all, on the far left, is Brian Holton, who did Chinese at Edinburgh and Durham, taught at both universities. First director of translating and interpreting program there. 9 years working in Hong Kong as a translator. A publisher of Chinese verse into English and into Scots, two very different languages, absolutely distinct. And he and chap next to him and Yang Lian are responsible for this anthology, extraordinary anthology, which has just almost this minute come out, the Jade Lada, published by Blood Axe. Bill is, when I last caught up with him, it was 10 volumes of poetry. Is it now more? So, anyway, it's a good... Well, I counted 10. They're on my shelf. So, well-known poet in Scots and in English, and his collections have been shortlisted for four or five of the major poetry prizes. He's Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle. Now, more will emerge about these people as we go along, just what their experience in the world of the translating Chinese is. Yang Lian, next to him, born in Switzerland, grew up in Beijing, and was one of the founders of the so-called Misty School of Writing, poetry in Chinese. We'll hear more about that. In 1989, he was abroad then, and he was effectively then in exile, and has been in exile since, living latterly, and for I think the longest period now, in the United Kingdom, in Stoke Newington still?
I've been living here since 97,
right.
So it's
a long time. Yeah.
Half of me, no.
Yeah.
Certain percentage of me
Excellent.
Are here, totally. This is hard.
And immediately next to me here is Nikki Harman, literary translator. Finished between October and December, did a residency at Free Word as a translator in residence. I think that's a new idea and post altogether, has much to say about that. And is here in at least two capacities. One as the translator of poetry, of this book, which is even hotter off the press than the Jade Lada. I've this minute been handed a copy. These are translations of Han Dong. She's on again tonight as the translator of short stories for Comma Press, also by Han Dong, that's true?
Yes, not entirely. He's one of the stories in
One
the
of
book.
the stories in it. Good. Those are the four chief experts on all this, and we'll do our best to move up and down. What I'd like to say, though, just by preamble, is that my name is David Constantine. I'm here as one of the editors of Modern Poetry and Translation. When I came to prepare this session here, I found to my great satisfaction and pride, actually, that of the 17 issues that Helen and I have put together in our term as editors, 8 of them have Chinese poetry in them. And the range, again, it's just the way the magazine is, goes from the 4th century AD to absolutely now. In fact, in the last issue, we have the results of a poetry competition. Our first, Brian was one of the runners-up for an extraordinary poem. So it is absolutely up to the minute that men and women. So we've done quite well, not as it were programmatically, just because that's the nature of the magazine. Those are the people who will be here, not just contributing, but actually principally forming the discussion that we shall now begin. For convenience, I've divided it into three main areas, not one of which will we get anywhere near exhausting. The first one I've called the situation of the poet in China. That inevitably has to do with the somewhat fraught position of many poets in China, but I shall make immediately clear that what we can say about China does not apply just to China. Secondly, something about tradition, because I don't know whether I'm odd in this, but most of what I know about Chinese poetry has to do with the so-called classical canon of Chinese verse. I've been thinking an awful lot latterly in my own work about what, in any culture, in the United Kingdom, for example, is left of any sense of a unitary culture or continued and continuing tradition. And having read the forward and the preface to this, and also work by Yang Lian before, I understand him to be a writer who not just respects, but admires and feeds deeply off the tradition, which is nevertheless in China a very, very disrupted and problematic thing, which this Jade Lada anthology addresses extremely well, I think. And the third area, and the most important in some ways, is just simply the question of translation, of how people go about it. Because again, as I looked at what the three over there have done, what Nikki has done, and then my own practice of translation, we have very, very different modes, ways of going about it, and possibly then also understandings of what the whole thing entails and signifies. So the third part of it will have to do with strictly the business of bringing Chinese poetry into the English language and into English culture, but it will bring about, I hope, a proper discussion of how people go about translation altogether, what they understand by it, what it entails, and what it, so to speak, says about the relationship between translator and poet. In each case, I'll say a few introductory things, but then we'll immediately hand over to people who know more about it. Everybody knows, and I hope I'm not just repeating stuff you've already heard, that this book fair, all book fairs are in some way or other fraught. This is not really unusually fraught. They all have been. At least 35 writers are in prison in China, some serving sentences of up to 20 years. Later, we should be talking about how literature gets known, the unitary canon, act of reading. Obviously, what's happened in China and elsewhere is that access to the net has meant that access to poetry has been blown wide open. It is actually very, very difficult indeed to hold it down and to corral it in any way. This poem, a short poem by Zhu Yufu, was posted on the internet, and the title of the poem is It's Time. I read it, it's only 12 lines long. Yufu was sentenced on the 10th of February to 7 years in jail. This is a poem by him, translated by A.E. Clark. It's time, people of China, it's time. The square belongs to everyone. With your own 2 feet, it's time to head to the square and make your choice. It's time, people of China, it's time. A song belongs to everyone. From your own throat, it's time to voice the song in your heart. It's time, people of China, it's time. China belongs to everyone. Of your own will, it's time to choose what China shall be. Now, before we start feeling holier than thou about this and better off than anywhere else in the world, any of you who went anywhere near St. Paul's during the Occupy movement will know very well that if you'd tried to occupy Paternoster Square, you would have been met by a barricade across the entrance to that, by the police force and by private security guards. The reason why the Occupy movement moved to and occupied the steps of St. Paul's was that they were not allowed in Paternoster Square, which looks like a public space, which looks like the very emblem, if you like, of the res publica, the public space, the public thing, and to which you do not have access if they don't choose to give you access. So we have no particular feeling in this country that we are doing especially well, but we don't actually lock people up for poetry. I want to say something now about, if you like, the intrinsically dissident nature of verse wherever, and then move on to the particularities of the situation in China and, in Yang Lian's case, in exile. MacNeice said of the world, it is incorrigibly plural, and poetry itself not just respects but continually and faithfully respects the intrinsic plurality of the world. All management, all governments detest more or less plurality. Anything plural is harder to manage than anything unitary and singular. Any totalitarian regime, think of the National Socialist regime in particular, not just detests plurality, but by hook or by crook seeks to eradicate it and exterminate it. Amnesty's motto, as you know, is protect the human. The motto of poetry should be say the human, keep saying it in its plurality, and by simply saying it wherever you are, you won't get locked up for doing it, you'll be ignored in the United Kingdom, but by keeping on saying it, you make the whole populace, you make the citizenry harder to manage. And if there's a responsibility that is enjoined upon poets, it's to make people harder to manage, to insist that we all have individual faces, individual voices, and individual aspirations. That's me. Now, I want to come now particularly to China. Many years ago, I reviewed a copy of the August Sleepwalker by Bei Dao, translated by Bonnet McDougall, who's well represented in this anthology. As far as I could understand it then, his dissidence consisted in simply saying the human, in being singularly human and expressing that. In that sense, writing apolitical poetry in the context of a country which insisted on poetry lining up in favor of things was itself a dissident act. Perhaps now you could say whether the situation is very much changed in that sense. Yang Lian writes from the position of effective exile, as I say, from 1989. Perhaps Yang first would say, what would now constitute dissidence? Does it consist wholly or chiefly in acts of opposition, or in simply trying to be yourself as a poet?
Well, thank you very much, David. My question, or even kind of an argument on, the way to use the word of exile too often, but therefore somehow very easily making it rusty or even lost meaning. And the question from me is, who is not in exile if you are a creative person? Whatever in your own country or outside of so-called your own country. I think the poets in the world is living in the same situation and writing about this situation if you are writing the poetry. That's why I create this word. Poetry is our unique mother tongue. Because if you let the poets from different countries, but let them read together, and then you will see the understanding of a life and the way to transcend that situation into the creative poetry writing, and that is very similar, very similar. So from my own case, yes, I started writing during the darkest time China was in the 20th century, the Cultural Revolution. And the 1979, the last year of Cultural Revolution, when my mother died, and that was the darkest moment in my youth time. But that was also the year I started my poetry writing. The second point of fate, it was 1993, when I call the darkest moment in my exile, because the dream of returning to China is becoming impossible. But journey in the West is endless. Then again, the poet Gu Cheng commit suicide, killed his wife, commit suicide that year. But that was the year I wrote Where the Sea Stands Still. And the last line, this shore is where we see ourselves set sail. Imagine the image. You stand on the coast and watching yourself on the boat set sail. All journeys externally, It's actually part of internal journey. And this is not only a line of poem, but a formula of understanding about my life outside of China as well as my life inside of China. And in this so-called global movement, China moving so fastly, like but also contradictory, hugely contradictory. But again, this is the time maybe China becoming a sign of the global, which is the spiritual crisis. It's much more serious than the so-called economic crisis. The selfish and cynical attitude in the whole world, it was so much more or much clear today. So the Chinese poetry play not only importance for Chinese culture today, but also for the world. Yeah. Well, maybe you also read this poem, the poet is in jail, but again, if you know China, and you will see so many poetry websites, which is just hugely active, hugely serious also, you know, and so in that case, you also find a poetry which I call the ballast, the stone being put into the boat, therefore keep the boat sail stably, and even within the storms. And this ballast of poetry is for Chinese culture, but for the Western too. Yeah, Jade Lada is the ballast made between us.
We'll come back to that. Nikki, could you, from your point of view, you've translated a poet who, if I understand correctly, is not overtly dissident. Am I simplifying grossly?
Yes.
Thanks. But whose poetry, yes. Carry on.
Okay, so yes, I've translated Han Dong. I certainly wouldn't say he's not overly dissident. He's overtly dissident. When he started writing poetry in the 1980s, or since then, he's been a leader, really, of one kind of Chinese poetry. I find it very difficult to summarize all this sort of off the cuff. It's because it's hugely complex. He's run websites and blogs. He's indeed had a website shut down. He's mentored numerous other poets. He has a different way of preserving his political, as it were, his internal integrity. I think he would agree with the way Yang Lian described it, which is to say that every poet, how did you put it? Every poet inside themselves is a dissident, is an exile within themselves. So, yes, if you want to know more about him, buy the book.
Yes, I was just going to say, over there on the left now.
Every book in China, in the People's Republic, has to be approved by the local Bureau of Culture at the provincial level. And I'm married to a woman who's a non-contentious, non-political writer, but I provided an introduction to one of her books in which I quoted the Scottish writer and painter Alistair Gray when he said, "Work as though you live in the early days of a better nation." And that was removed by the Bureau of Culture, because to suggest that the People's Republic of China was in any sense less than perfect was not permitted. And these kind of tiny little harassments happen all the time.
I think it's probably important to say that that these issues of how to read resistance and dissidence are built into the period of poetry that we're looking at a technical level. The Menglongxi, the misty poets, are so called by the authorities because their work seemed to them to be obscure. And of course, this obscurity is in part to do with their inability to read clearly and well a poem, but secondly, it is to do with an act of taking the resistance into the poem on a technical level, of making the imagery a source of resistance and bringing dissidents into an aesthetic field of debate. It's It's a matter of the quality of the poem. That's what makes, I think, the Chinese poetry this period so interesting, not its overt political content.
And it's not just China. There was a wonderful story from the 1980s that the censors in Poland realized that works were slipping through the net and being published because the censors weren't recognizing irony. So the censors were sent abroad to America and Britain to study English literature and learn how to recognize irony. It was too late.
Same thing happened in Malawi with Jack Mapanji, whose first books slipped by because people hadn't really realized how subversive they were, and they had to learn to read allegorically.
Yeah, that's right. What Yang Lian says about exile, as it were, being the human condition, or the condition of every poet at least, as somebody who is not physically in exile, I would have been very chary of saying that. But since he said it and is, then it's kind of okay. I was at a conference some years ago in East Anglia where it was very forcibly put to us by Palestinian writers that we had no right whatsoever to speak of exile unless we were physically in it. That to speak of exile as it's, so to speak, the given of the human condition in any existentialist fashion was just idle and was just something that intellectuals could well indulge themselves in. The condition of exile, I was told by Barghouti actually, the real condition of exile and homelessness was Palestinian women giving birth in the dust at the feet of Israeli soldiers at checkpoints because they weren't allowed to get to hospital in time. Now, I'm interested that Yang Lian has, as it were, humanized and generalized the thing, because that is, in a sense, my feeling that poetry is automatically marginal, although its input, where it rightly belongs, is central, and that the language of poetry is at a very, very strange remove, indeed, from the language of ordinary discourse. Now, does that in any way...
I want to add a little bit. When I actually point out the exile actually is the nature of human being, and almost every culture. One very concrete thing, I was in China, in Sichuan, Chengdu last year. I walked through the home of a great Tang Dynasty poet, Du Fu, where also I was there 30 years ago exactly. By then, I was a young, stupid poet and know his name, but simply didn't understand him. But after 30 years, after my own exile, after myself like a boat without anchor, but those years, every day like an ending, but the ending itself, endless. And then I walk there and recite his poem by heart and realized that I didn't not just been writing myself into Chinese tradition, but been living in the tradition. And with this in mind, and I have to say, at the very beginning, when we have the idea to edit the new anthology of contemporary Chinese poetry, we, or at least I, thought very clearly, all those so-called titles, underground in China, exile outside of China, has no value to play anything in the standard of the poetry here. We judge nothing but poetry quality. That means the depth of thinking and the individual creative power of writing in the works. Because I do believe the very individuality proved by the poetry writing, this poetical questioning to self must including the layer of your principles on the reality, I mean political. So the poetical, which in order to build up your individuality, that means political. So it's not making two separate and against each other, but one actually content another. So in this case, those poems, the original is, let's say, all are quite extreme. Therefore, challenging the translators and the translations extremely. Yeah. So in this case, we finally making the extremely deep exchanges.
We shall come to translation in good time, and that's the most important part of all this, I agree. You touched on Tu Fu there, and I quote you, or yes, it's your introduction to this. Our motivation is simple, you say. We are watched by Ku Yuan and Tu Fu, And when did these great poets throw their works into the ring without great care? That is to say that for you, and I think I would really like to say for any seriously practicing poet in any culture, it is not possible to be nowhere. It is better to understand where you are in relation to your own past. And I mark it very strongly in your work, and I should like to know what Nikki thinks about this as well, that you can't actually operate without these, as it were, great watchers, not crushing you, but being there as a sort of moral, principled, because of the integrity of the work, association down the ages. I should like to know, because it concerns me as much to do with the culture, deeply fragmented culture of the United Kingdom, as to the country that we're now talking about, China, whether there is now such a thing, would you say, as a sense of tradition, a feeling of obligation to tradition, and any sense whatsoever of unitary readership. Now, you've already mentioned the web, which clearly has blown the whole thing wide open. Is the web still concerned in China with something that you would think of as a unitary culture and a sense of where you've come from? Perhaps Bill for a moment.
Well, I think it's no accident that both of the editor, the main translator, principal editor of this anthology are Scottish and are therefore only too aware of splintered and discontinuous traditions and the gap between literary and spoken language in many categories. But I think that the simple answer to your question is that I think writers in the UK are particularly receptive to a point which it seemed that Chinese writing had reached over the course of the work gathered in this anthology, which I've described as a point of equidistance, where they are, as it were, equally estranged from their classical tradition as they are from the contemporary situation, particularly with many of them being forced into exile. And they are equally distant or estranged from the Western tradition. So there's a kind of a moment of poise in a lot of these writers' work, a moment of disquiet, a moment which I think is which resonates very strongly with us as poets and readers of poetry. But I think it is the Chinese note, right, as it were.
Yeah. Nikki, do you have any?
Maybe we should read something.
Can we
just.
Why is it too dry to talk?
What I say is never dry. No, yes, I just wanted to say something quickly in response to that. I mean, it's very hard to find myself speaking on behalf of a poet who is around here but is unfortunately involved in another event, so can't be here. But he did have a blog which appeared last week in English on the Penn World Atlas site, which says very interestingly that he feels that China has three traditions: the tradition of 3,000 years of Chinese poetry, and then 2 lots of 30 years. Well, if you can work out the mathematics of that, the first lot of 30 years was 1949 to 1979, and then the next lot of 30 years, and this is the point he made again this morning at a meeting up there with another poet, Xi Chuan, is that the last lot of 30 years in terms of Chinese poetry is a mini tradition in itself, yes, and it sort of watched this space. It's quite an interesting point.
You'll get a reading in a moment, I promise. I guess most people who know about classical Chinese poetry know it because of Arthur Whaley's 170 Chinese poems, which came out first in 1918 and was immediately terribly effective, influential in many, many ways in the years 1920s, in the years of British modernism and American modernism, big debates about his manner of translating and Pound's manner of translating, and the two usually set against each other as antithetical. My own particular interest in this, my copy is 1969, by which time it was in something like its 16th or 20th edition. Brecht in exile, I mean really in exile, had he not gone into exile in 1933, he and his family would have been shot. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He left the country the day after the Reichstag fire and remained in exile then, in real exile, until 1948. lots and lots of German writers committed suicide in exile because they had no connection anymore. Playwrights did because they had no audience. The poets did because nobody was reading them. Now, Brecht survived, first of all, in Scandinavia, but then in the United States of America. And he actually used this volume in the English translations, translated into rough German for him by his friend Elisabeth Hauptmann, and produced poems that he called Chinese poems in German, which, particularly in the case of Po Chu-yi, the poet whom he liked best, an exiled poet himself, a critical poet, a poet deeply critical of the status quo, of the government of its day, a poet who wrote in what at least Whaley understood as relatively simple diction, who was said, like Molière actually, to have tested his verses on the serving girl to see whether she got it and liked it. If the popular people, if ordinary people liked it, then Po Chu-yi went ahead with it. Exactly Brecht's own mode of operation. So you see a poet appropriating a remote poet, a poet remote in time and in culture, through English into German, to write about things which were deeply pertinent to him. And actually, this is another mode of translation, to translate then in a way as to annex the poem, if you like, in the anti-fascist struggle. There's a famous one called The Dragon of the Black Pool, which Whaley calls a satire. It's a satire against credulity, particularly religious credulity. Brecht alters it significantly in the middle to make it have to do with this catastrophic credulity, sheep-like catastrophic credulity of the German people in 1933 when they elected, don't ever forget that, he was legally elected Hitler to power. So one of the poems from that era, so far back, 7th century I think AD, into 1938 is being used via translation. Now that's a use of tradition, it's an annexing of somebody else's tradition for the very present moment. Is there any of that still going on?
Well, I suppose I'd counter that. I acknowledge and I see the key purpose and the strength that Brecht drew from that. But I think it is one of the signal aspects of our anthology, Nikki perhaps qualify this as well, that we are not annexing, we are not doing the translations that we feel have most obvious, overt relevance to a Western audience. In fact, the principle of construction of the book was that Yang Nian and Qin Xiaoyu, the associate editors, selected the poems. We did not pick the poems we thought were translatable. In fact, as he just said, he picked the poems he thought we'd have a bit of a problem translating. And so the book is actually constructed almost entirely the other way around. Right. And I think that in itself is a kind of a move away from just a Eurocentric way of conceiving of Chinese poetry. And of course, one of the great problems here is that our conception of Chinese poetry is so utterly dominated by the classical tradition that it is extremely hard for a contemporary audience to see round that and to see what is so unique, as Nikki says, about this mini tradition of the last 30 years, which in many ways is as exciting and has gone through such a series of devastating changes as the whole of the previous period.
Right. And of course, Brecht was blissfully unaware that Bauduit was not a socialist. He was an aristocrat. He was prefect of the great city of Hangzhou. He did much to beautify the lake there, if you've ever been to Hangzhou. And he may have read his poems to his charlady, but that was for stylistic reasons. Yeah. So Brecht's appropriation of his poetry would have shocked the man. You know, this is the problem, is that so many non-Chinese people appropriate Chinese poetry for their own purposes, as Ezra Pound did. Yeah.
It's not to sorry, a bit of street crept in there. Yeah. It's not to disrespect Pound. It's simply to say that we're working from a slightly different paradigm now, which reflects an actual global shift. I mean, I think we're not doing it for high-minded purposes.
Let me finish.
That way around.
Let me finish my point, though.
Oh, just a minute. I'll sort this out.
See you, pal.
Peace, love.
what I want to address Chinese people in the audience. What many Chinese people do not understand is that, first of all, English poetry and then the poetry of Europe was radically transformed 100 years ago by the work of Pound and Whaley, by what they took from Chinese poetry. Whaley never translated Du Fu. He couldn't find a voice for him. But the rather patrician voice of Bo Jui talking down to his char lady suited Whaley to the, Whaley's class was kind of the same, I mean, we all do that. Some poets some voices we can make sing and some we can't. But Pound also saw something that he wanted when he got Fenneyosa's notes on Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry. It wasn't about the essential nature of the poetry. He saw something that he wanted and took it. And I think it's a very, as Bill says, we have to really think about this. This whole project has been rethinking what we do. Can we take without knowledge? And to take Chinese poetry and rip it, contemporary poetry, rip it from the classical background with which it's in continual dialogue is a bit like trying to understand European culture without understanding that we once used Latin as our medium of communication, and ignoring the influence of Christianity on Europe. The dialogue between the contemporary poet and the tradition is very acute in China and very interesting. Because, remember, one last point, there are more books in Chinese than any other language. Nobody has ever read all the books in Chinese.
Excellent. We'll make a start now. We're moving on now to what is really I think probably the most important part and interesting part about this is just how these people have gone about translating. And we shall preface that with two brief, I'm being rude now, brief readings in Chinese and in English.
Give some examples. Yes, Nikki, please.
Oh, I think the Chinese comes first. Yang Lian has kindly agreed to read this short poem by Han Dong in Chinese. There you go.
The Chinese first, of course. Well, the poet is here in the city at least, but we don't know where the bird is. So I'm just read on his behalf.
Yes.
一些人不爱说话. It sounds very simple, but let's see. 一些人不爱说话，既不是哑巴，也不内向，只说必要的话，只是礼节只浮在说话的上面，一生就将这样过去。寥寥数语即可概括。一些人活着就像墓志铭，漫长但言辞简短，像墓碑那样伫立着，与我们冷静相对。
Some people don't like to talk. Some people don't like to talk. They're not dumb or introverted. They only speak when necessary. Just courtesies, just floating on the surface of talk. They spend their whole lives like that. It can be summed up very briefly. The way some people live is like an epitaph. Long years, but the words are short and simple. Upright as tombstones, they stand soberly before us.
Okay. This is yours. Next poem, select from the Jade Lada. Actually, this poem written by Zhang Zao, whom actually died 2 years ago. I personally think he was the best poet in the so-called younger generation. In Chinese case, on one side, 1,000 years of ancient history. Secondly, the generation of poets are so short and quick. Every 5 years, they call a next generation. So this poet was born in 62 or something, 7 years younger than I am, already being called next generation. But anyway, he had been living in Germany for more than 20 years as students and teaching. He wrote wonderful poems there. The poems, as I said in a London Review of Books, well, the poems like flowers, but blooms toward to inside. And it's not easy to open up that poem for the translation or in the translation. So that's why he had been left there. Nobody really, in English, nobody really touched him to translate him or some. This Jade Lada was the first chance for him to exist in English. So therefore, we select quite many poems of his works. Again, he was not being called the exiled poet, but you can recognize that internal dissidence inside of him, whatever on all layers, of life. So it's a wonderful thing to read and to share not only political happening, but the living situation. The English title is
Motherland Miscellany.
Okay.
Motherland Miscellany.
祖国葱书，那溢满又跑下的，那不是酒，那还不是樱桃，吐出后比死人更多挂一点肉。井底的小男孩，人们还在打捞，直到夜半，直到窒息，才从云嘴落地的那只空酒瓶，还不是破碎。人类还容忍我穿过大厅，穿过打字机色情的沉默，那被拼写的还不是安装在水面又被手打肿的月亮的脸。船长啊，你的坏女人还没有打开水之窗，而我开始舔了。我舔着空气中明净的衣裳，我舔着被输液两脚夹紧的锦缎的小飘带，直到舔交换成被舔。我宁愿终身被舔，而不愿去生活。To the ghost.
Motherland Miscellany. What's overflowing? What's overflowing and running down? It's not booze. That's not yet a cherry pit with no more flesh on it than a corpse. The boy at the bottom of the well, people still salvaging stuff till the middle of the night, till suffocation. Only then an empty bottle, fallen to earth from the cloud's mouth, unbroken, will humans tolerate me passing through the lobby, passing through the sexy silence of typewriters. What's been spilled is still not the moon's face, installed on the water, beaten black and blue. Captain, oh Captain, your wicked women haven't opened the window of the water yet, but I've begun to lick. I'm licking the bright clothes of the air. I'm licking the little brocade streamers pressed between the feet of the pages, till licking is swapped for being licked. I'd rather be licked all life long, never wanting to live a life.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thank you very much indeed.
I want to add one thing. What actually makes the Jade Lada different from other anthologies, it is actually the book based on not only translation, but much more profound exchanges between the English and the Chinese poets. Since about 8 years ago, totally something like 5 times of deep exchanges between the Chinese and English poets had been made as a project. And the foundation of those projects was the poets translating each other. Through the translatings, all the layers, all the way from linguistic to the idea of poetry, had been discussed.
And that's what we'll talk about now. How you actually go about it, and we want to know in some detail. Nikki, I think, has translated, as it were, singly with her particular poet. Would that be correct? I just want to establish, first of all, as it were, different ways of going about it.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about them in detail.
Quite a particular way, I think. Han-Dong didn't really want to collaborate with me. He'd answer questions, but he regarded what I was producing as my own particular voice. And
no, that's good.
Yeah.
That's a distinct way of going about it. The three to the left of Nikki is another completely different way of going about it. My own preference has been to translate poets who can't possibly answer Barrett because they've been dead for 200 years. And in that resides an interesting dilemma, or if you like, more dynamism, which I hope we will get onto. And that is this. Translation is service. You are serving an original. You are doing it because you believe that original ought to be brought into your own language and enjoy wider circulation. You do it for the good that it will do it. Translation in that sense is serving somebody else, which is why in the 19th century it was thought a fit occupation for women. Translators would translate male authors. It was an act of service, still somewhat is in that sense. The making of a poem relies utterly and totally on autonomy, of having the freedom to make what you want. When you translate a poem, you are trying to make a poem in this extraordinary paradox of service and the bid for autonomy. And I'd like us to talk about your way of doing it, which is actually an extreme form of collaboration, and Nikki's, which is, so to speak, the only kind of collaboration I've ever had sounds rather like Nikki's. That is to say that the poet would help, and then you would actually go off and, is it so, make a poem of your own. Exactly. Well, it's those.
But I also feel the poets is serving to the translators by to write extremely difficult poems for them, because well, it's joking but not. It's the quality of translation is based on actually the standard or the quality of original. The higher standard or the quality of the original that may create or challenge or whatever from the translator.
Okay, no.
So
I think if we move the paradigm along a little, rather than the poem, the translation being at the service of the poem, it was a dialogue with. And we understood dialogue to take place on many levels. And the first part of that, I suppose, was, as Yang Nian was saying, the continuity of the contact between the writers. It wasn't poem specific. It wasn't project specific. And I guess kind of arts administration question, we had to go beyond the limits of projects to arrive at a condition of sufficient community and sufficient intimacy. So then you have several levels of dialogue which are possible.
Did that start with the Scotland-China project, or was it before that?
Yeah, this back in 2005. Yeah. So, and there is this simple dialogue which we are conducting now, poet to poet, but there also was something arising from our own work. The poems were speaking to the poems. And then there was the dialogue, which is the actual act of translation, which was in both directions. And so there was a kind of a deeper sense of exchange there. Now, the crucial point about this is that here's where my gross amateurness comes in. I do not speak Chinese. In fact, if you want to shout out another language, I won't speak that either. It's entirely down to the intensity and closeness of the communication between writers that I am able to translate at all, and that requires a focus on the line and the relationship between the line and the poem. So we have a paradoxical action going on here, which is that the surface has to yield all the depth. The surface has to yield all the cultural depth. And that, again, requires a strong link between the two parties. And it points to something which I think is very key to this book and to the projects which we've been engaged in, which is if you're a poet and you're translating, you translate greedily. You translate in order to be sustained and in order to be developed and challenged by something in the text you are translating.
I think this issue of service, perhaps that is perhaps acceptable in the first listening stage, when you're listening to what the poet is saying, to find that voice. But I think that has to be transcended and left in the second stage, where you're creating a poem. Because let's face it, I don't buy this distinction between a poet and a translator. My job as a translator of poetry is to make poems. My job is to make pictures in your heads, just the same as theirs. We steal our source material differently, but it's the same thing we're doing. And the making of a poem is what's fundamental to this. making a voice. Now, I've used in the past the image of the ventriloquist and the dummy. I've worked for more than 20 years with you. For 20 years now, Yang and I have been working together. We're like an old married couple. Right? But whose hand is up the back of whose jacket? I'm never certain. Right? Now, Yang and I mean, Yang will write me a paragraph about a line. If I query a line and say, what does this mean? Because being a translator is not the same as being a mind reader. I don't know what he's thinking. I only know what he's saying. Right? But he's very, very helpful. Some poets I've worked with don't understand this. But we have built up this dialogue to the point where I'm quite happy to describe them as our poems. Although, mind you, just a small final point, I get very tired of reviewers telling me, English-speaking reviewers telling me what a wonderful poet Yang Lien is. I'm sure he is, but they've not read him, they've read me.
Well, this is the dialogue, anyway, yeah. So the third language.
Well, there's half of me, I think, which is envious of that process that you've gone through, because I can see, and I could see when you launched the book at London Review of Books the other night, how very fruitful and complicated and interesting and passionate that process obviously was.
And fun.
I have the same passionate process going on inside myself. But, you know, I completely agree with what Brian said, that the end result for me has got to be a poem. I was lucky. I didn't work totally by myself. I mean, actually, Brian had a look at some of the poems for me and discussed them with me. I did talk to Han Dong about some bits of some of them, but actually I think it's not really in his nature to want to articulate what he put in his poems, and in a way that's just the kind of person he is, and I respect that. Then of course there are editors who can be very wonderful people. So I certainly didn't work entirely all on my own. This is not entirely all my own work, although most of it is. The mistakes are certainly mine. Yeah, I think that's...
Well, what Benjamin said, the translation is not the original only. It's not the target language only. That translation is a third language, which is a great way to understand the thing like this. This kind of a deep exchange between the poets and translator, in our case, between the poet and poets. And it's maybe even when the poets translating each other, image by image, line by line, maybe we were weaker than the weaker on the knowledge of language, but the poetry understanding, it's like an lightning, you know. So that is the best way to open some special case. For example, China. You know, China, with its huge and fast and often contradictory changes, and the understanding of this reality, it's not only the problem of the foreigners, but to Chinese too. And this kind of understanding, and together with the deep discussions, that drives even my understanding about my own poems or the poems written in Chinese so wonderfully. And therefore, well, you see, the question Chinese, how the Chinese understand the world, how the world understand Chinese, how the faster change of like a Chinese or Arabic and this kind of cultures as the context of the new world. And address the question of every culture and every person, and reset up your own or our own stance, you know, in this situation. That is the meaning and the great beauty of this kind of a project. And that's why, well, layer by layer, step by step, anyway, London and UK becoming the best base of the deep exchanges between Chinese and English poetry. It's wonderful.
One of the things that was very striking, I think, to both Helen and me when we read the notes that Brian had written to his translation of Paleopithecus was the degree not just of collaboration between the poet and the translator, but between poets who were not actually, so to speak, in charge of that particular project, but whose opinion was sought as to the on particular lines, as Brian very candidly said, that Bill had quite a hand in, and another collaborator as well. So we're talking about collaboration that isn't, as it were, helping you towards a deeper linguistic understanding, not just that.
Let me very briefly outline the process.
So I've had my 5 minutes thing. There won't be questions. We'll meet people afterwards and go through things. In 3 minutes we stop, I promise.
Yang and Qin Xiaoyu, who's a young critic in Beijing, they selected the poems. They came to me. I worked with a young Hong Kong translator called Li Man Kei, who's at the beginning of her career. Very talented young woman. Together we did the first literals. Then we sent them to Yang, whose English is good enough to comment and say, no, you missed that, there's something here, you missed the joke, right? You know, that's the translator's worst nightmare, isn't it? That you don't see the joke. And then, much later, Bill came in and he and I sat down and went through them and polished these drafts into poems. So that's the collaboration. And at each stage there was discussion, there was arguments, there was biff, there was...
So it's like a football team. You know, the Chinese poet.
Or a very strange marriage.
We are at the back, just before our goal. But we have to establish this. And then we pass the ball to the translator, but I'm also watching him play in the midfield. And, but he cannot actually kick the ball into the goal the other side. The English poet, and again get the ball, and well, not only
this is a terrible time, balls out of play.
Not only that, actually to judge and to check the quality.
No extra time in
so finally
we talk now.
The goal is here.
The whistle.